I had no idea that letting my kids draw colorful chalk butterflies and hopscotch lines on the sidewalk would spark a ferocious battle with the HOA's most notorious enforcer. But when Karen threatened to ban all outdoor play because of a little chalk dust, I decided enough was enough. Little did I know, in my quest to protect a bit of innocent sidewalk art, I'd stumble onto something far bigger. Karen was secretly padding the HOA's fees, charging neighbors money for maintenance that never happened. If you love dramatic showdowns where the bully gets exposed for dirty dealings, stay tuned to see how a simple act of chalk drawing became the match that lit a fuse. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Taleflow for more insane HOA tailies, and comment if you've ever fought over something as harmless as sidewalk chalk. Because trust me, if you think chalk is innocent, just wait. I moved into this quiet cul-de-sac with my two kids about 3 years ago. It seemed like the perfect place for them to run around with friends, ride bikes, and do all the fun things kids do outdoors. The sidewalks were wide and the neighbors seemed welcoming enough. We even had a little park nearby where families would gather for summer picnics. Life was good until Karen assumed her throne as HOA president. Suddenly, the simplest joys turned into potential violations. Everything had to be aesthetically pleasing, or else you'd get a notice taped to your door. At first, I escaped her radar. Some neighbors told horror stories about Karen fining them for having a kiddie pool that was the wrong shade of blue or leaving a soccer ball in the front yard for more than an hour. I guess my place was just tidy enough to slip by. Then my kids discovered sidewalk chalk. They started drawing big colorful murals, rainbows, unicorns, hopscotch grids. Seeing them so happy warmed my heart, just a bit of chalk dust, easily washed away by the next rain. But apparently that dust offended Karen. One cloudy afternoon, I heard a sharp knock at the door. I opened it to see her standing there, arms folded, scowling at me like I'd committed a crime. She held up her phone, showing pictures of my kids' chalk drawings. "We have rules about defacing neighborhood sidewalks," she declared. "Your children are leaving unsightly marks that degrade the property values." My jaw nearly hit the floor. Chalk defacing property. I tried to reason with her, explaining how chalk was temporary. She just sniffed and said, "It's an eyesore, make them stop." Then she walked off, leaving me dumbfounded. I brushed it off at first, figuring she was just overreacting. The next day, though, my kids came in from playing, complaining that some mean lady told them they couldn't draw on the sidewalk anymore. Sure enough, Karen had confronted them while I was inside, telling them it was against the rules. My kids came home nearly in tears, chalk in hand. At that point, my protective instincts kicked in. I decided to look up the actual HOA bylaws. Nothing mentioned chalk or kids playing on sidewalks. It was a public walkway, after all. The only mention of defacement referred to permanent paint or graffiti. Chalk was ephemeral, so I marched down to the HOA office, hoping to clarify the nonsense. Karen was there, rummaging through files, giving me a glare when I stepped in. "Yes," she said, feigning politeness. I calmly asked her to show me the rule that banned sidewalk chalk. She flipped through some official documents, tapping her nails, then claimed it fell under general community cleanliness. I insisted that was a stretch, pointing out the kids' doodles wash away in the rain. She responded with a smirk. "Rain or not, they look messy. If you don't comply, we'll impose a fine." I left, seething. I refused to let her bully me into punishing my kids for enjoying a harmless pastime. The next morning, a violation notice appeared on my door, stating I owed a $25 fine for sidewalk defacement. I laughed bitterly, but it wasn't so funny the following week, when another notice escalated the fine to $50. She was serious. Meanwhile, my kids were miserable, restricted to chalk doodles in our backyard, on the small patch of concrete by the garage. They missed the big sidewalks where they could spread out their art. A few neighbors actually commented that they loved seeing the colorful drawings. One said it brightened her morning walks, yet Karen remained adamant the chalk had to stop. Frustrated, I confided in a neighbor, Lynn, who had also faced Karen's wrath over something silly, some unapproved stepping stones in her front garden. Lynn said she'd looked into the HOA finances after noticing our dues had gone up 10% this year with no visible improvements. She suspected Karen was padding the budget. That piqued my curiosity. Why raise dues if there were no new projects? We had the same old park benches, the same old landscaping. Where was that extra money going? Lynn said she tried to attend the last few board meetings, but Karen often canceled them last minute or held them at odd hours. A pattern started forming in my mind. Maybe Karen was making up petty violations to generate fine revenue that she then funneled somewhere else. But was that paranoid thinking? I decided to do some detective work. I requested a copy of the HOA's financial reports. By law, homeowners can review them. Karen delayed, claiming complications, but eventually gave me a binder of spreadsheets that looked official enough. I pored over them for hours, but something about the maintenance category seemed off. There were large lumps of money allocated for beautification, repairs, MISC, improvements. Yet walking around the neighborhood, I saw no new beautification projects. The park had the same peeling paint. The sidewalks had the same cracks. Where was the money going? I asked Lynn to help me cross-reference old budgets. The difference from last year's budget to this year's was striking. Fines collected soared by 40%, mostly from community cleanliness violations. Chalk doodles, garden ornaments, kids' bikes left in driveways. Meanwhile, the MISC, improvements line soared by the exact same amount. Could Karen be funneling fine money into some hidden account? With Karen lording over the finances, there was no oversight. Maybe that explained why she was so gung-ho about punishing harmless chalk. She needed every penny. Before I could delve deeper, Karen escalated again. She posted a new letter on the community website claiming sidewalk chalk ban. It demanded all chalk usage stop immediately or face larger fines. She cited feedback from concerned residents, which must have been fabricated. The next morning, my older son tried to draw a small hopscotch grid, and within minutes, Karen marched up, phone in hand, snapping pictures. The poor kid was petrified. Enough was enough. I decided if Karen wanted to scare me with fines, I'd scare her with something bigger, an investigation into the HOA's finances. But first, I needed solid evidence. Maybe I could trace where those MISC, improvements, checks were going if I found the right records. So I returned to the HOA office, demanding all receipts or invoices for that line item. Karen was conveniently absent. The assistant, Tony, looked anxious but handed me a file. "Please don't tell her I gave this to you," he whispered. My heart fluttered. This could be the proof. Inside the file, I found half a dozen receipts from random vendors. Each had vague descriptions like landscaping materials or lighting upgrades. The amounts were in the thousands, but no addresses or itemized lists. Something reeked of fraud. Then I spotted a name, PK Services, repeated multiple times. I tried Googling them, no real website, no local listing. Suspicion soared. Was PK Services a shell company? That might be how Karen was embezzling funds. If so, I needed to connect that name to her. But how? I confided in another neighbor, Marcus, who was more tech-savvy. He offered to do some deeper searches on PK Services. Meanwhile, I prepared for the next HOA meeting, which Karen had scheduled for a Tuesday evening. Probably hopping people wouldn't come. Lynn and I rallied neighbors who were sick of the chalk ban. We wanted to show up in force. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early, scanning the room. Usually these gatherings had a handful of people, but tonight it was packed. Word spread that something big was about to happen. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by two board members who seldom spoke. She had that smug look, as if certain she could handle any challenge. She started the meeting by announcing the sidewalk chalk ban was now official, citing it as a safety measure. People groaned. One father stood up, demanding to know how chalk threatened safety. Karen gave a circular answer about slip hazards. The crowd murmured in frustration. Then I stood, heart-pounding, and said, "What about the HOA's finances? We see fines going up, but we're not seeing improvements. Could you account for the thousands under MISC? Improvements?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "Of course we're using them for community betterment," she insisted. "Flowers, new benches, general repairs." She tried to move on, but Lynn chimed in, "Where are those repairs exactly? The benches look the same, the sidewalks are still cracked, and we haven't seen any new flower beds." Karen's face reddened. The audience buzzed. "We have invoices," she snapped. "Everything is in order." That's when Marcus stepped forward, an iPad in hand. He discovered that PK Services wasn't a registered business in our state. The addresses on the receipts were vacant lots or PO boxes. Gasps arose. Karen blinked rapidly, repeating that it was a legitimate vendor. People pressed her. "Show us official contact info, pictures of their work." She fumbled, claimed they were a mobile operation, then abruptly tried to change topics. The tension soared, a living thing in the room. Neighbors demanded transparency. Karen's bored allies squirmed. I could smell fear wafting from Karen's direction. She stammered that she'd provide more details at a later date, but the crowd wasn't having it. Then came the perfect storm. A mother named Denise, whose daughter had been singled out for drawing too many flowers, showed the group the latest fine letter, which demanded $75. She brandished it in the air, tears in her eyes, saying, "Karen, how can you justify this? My child is in elementary school just doodling." The crowd erupted. People demanded refunds, demanded the chalk ban be lifted, demanded an audit. Karen tried to gavel the meeting to a close, but the crowd overpowered her. She threatened to have security escort people out. Security? We didn't even have neighborhood security. She was bluffing, and we knew it. Some folks started chanting for her resignation. Others rummaged in their bags, pulling out their own questionable finds. My guess was that Karen realized the game was up. She tried to gather her papers and leave, but neighbors blocked the exit, calling for a board vote. The two quiet board members turned to each other, whispered nervously, then one cleared his throat. We propose an immediate investigation into the HOA finances. Until then, all new fines are suspended. The room burst into applause. Karen looked like she might explode. She insisted they had no right to do that, but they outvoted her, setting an emergency motion. People cheered. The chalk ban was effectively put on hold until the investigation concluded. It felt like a huge victory for the kids, like color was returning to the sidewalks. Over the next couple weeks, an external auditor was brought in to comb through the HOA books. Karen was forced to hand over everything, from old receipts to bank statements. The rumor mill suggested they found glaring inconsistencies, with large sums paid to PK services, which seemed to funnel into an account suspiciously linked to someone in Karen's family. The board threatened legal action if she didn't cooperate. Meanwhile, the chalk ban was quietly dropped. In fact, some neighbors organized a Chalk the Block event, inviting all kids and even some adults to color the sidewalks in defiance of the old ban. Karen was conspicuously absent, presumably holed up somewhere, hoping she could salvage her crumbling power. Finally, the day of the big reveal came at a special HOA session. The auditor presented a scathing report. PK Services was a front, the MISC. Improvements were never done and the money had been siphoned off. The exact total was in the 5 figures. The crowd erupted in outrage. The board demanded Karen resign immediately. She tried to babble about how it was all a misunderstanding, claiming she'd been misled by a dishonest contractor. But it was no use. People had had enough. The board voted unanimously to remove her. She stormed out, threatening lawsuits, but we never saw them materialize. As for me and my chalk-loving kids, we got a formal apology from the new interim HOA president, a refund of any fines we'd paid, though I hadn't actually paid them, just received the notices, and the sidewalk chalk ban was permanently lifted. Now the sidewalks are alive with color, kids giggling as they scribble rainbows and planets. The best part. The neighborhood took a long, hard look at how fines were handled, implementing new checks and balances so no single person could abuse the system for personal gain. It was a sweet victory, knowing that a little chalk dust exposed Karen's dirty money scheme and helped the community come together. I sometimes walk along those vibrant sidewalks, admiring the doodles and thinking how, if Karen had just let kids be kids, she might still be in power, quietly skimming funds. Instead, she got greedy, tried to ban chalk, and ended up unraveling her own corruption. There's a certain poetic justice in that. It reminds me that sometimes the smallest acts, like drawing with a stub of chalk, can topple the biggest bullies. So if your HOA Karen tries to clamp down on innocent fun, keep your eyes open. You never know what secrets might be hidden in the accounting books, waiting for someone to connect the dots. Thank you for listening to this winding tale of sidewalk chalk, petty fines, and the hidden money trail that spelled the end of Karen's reign. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to Taleflow, hit that like button, and drop a comment below about the craziest HOA rule you've encountered. Because trust me, no matter how small the chalk line, it might just lead to something huge.